Hey guys, how are all of you beautiful people? Hope all of you are doing great. This is next part of What If Naruto Repeat Chunin Exam, where Naruto finds he is flung back in time and must repeat the entire Chunin exam over and over and over, until he gets it right and possibly saves Konoha in the bargain. So let's start without any delay. Seeing via a quick glance that her leader wasn't going to defend her, the red-haired sound maiden assumed a battle stance and brought her flute up, glaring at Naruto. Don't come any closer. You aren't going to break me, you, censored, who boy is this really censored? The next thing Teiya knew, the boy had body switched for her flute. In a moment, he had her immobilized from a temporary paralysis technique shot at point-blank range, and followed that up with a shot of his hands to her temples, accompanied by a surge of the most amazing memories. What was that last technique you used? Orochimaru asked curiously. Censored. Teiya was bending over, holding her temples and shaking her head over the recent input. Naruto held up an admonishing finger. Now, Teiya-chan, remember the first rule. Sorry. The girl fell on her knees before him, hands held up, asking for an apology, actions that caused the rest of the sound ninja to gape at her. Naruto spoke nonchalantly over his shoulder to Orochimaru and lied. Time dilation illusion based on the kaleidoscope Sharingan's ability to trap victims for what subjectively feels like days. While Naruto had such an illusion, what he'd really done was restore the redhead's memories of previous resets. Interesting, the snake Sanin grinned, then directed a sharp look to Teiya, who was still on her knees begging forgiveness. And what is the first rule? Naughty girls who use filthy words do not get any treats, Teiya recited automatically, without raising her head or changing her position of apology. Oh. QQQ, the Sanin chuckled, amused. Smiling, Naruto bent over to tell Teiya, well, I guess I could forgive the one slip, if it was a nice girl asking, that is. The Kunoichi instantly bowed in gratitude, then sprang up and away, using an earth-style wall to create a private changing area, which she landed in, and her hat and severely unflattering shirt came flying out moments later. Nice girl? Orochimaru questioned. Naruto shrugged and tossed a package in, and Teiya emerged a moment later wearing it. Raising a finger, she quoted, "Nice girls use pretty language, and take care to look their best." The rest of the sound ninja's jaws dropped open, looking at her. The former tomboy, who dressed like she'd robbed sackfuls of old clothes taken out of the dumpster of an all-boys orphanage, simply gleamed. She was in brightly colored Chinese-style clothes of green and gold, complementing her hair nicely, which had itself undergone a massive change from limp, dreadful stuff like seaweed plastered to her head, to an elaborate coiffure, standing up with tinkling ornaments before handing back down in a lovely drape across her shoulder blades. Makeup and grooming were also present, having been applied by Jutsu in seconds after her brief but thorough water Jutsu bath. She looked amazing, and the transformation was so thorough that Kidomaru raised his hands and channeled chakra into an illusion negation technique. To their shocked disbelief, there was no change. Teiya remained looking like a princess, instead of an orphaned street rat, as she calmly walked over and presented her hand to Naruto. Her team gaped in amazement over how thoroughly she'd been broken. "Those must be some treats," Jiruba muttered. "You have no idea," the girl returned with a brilliant courtly smile, causing eyes to bug out over the behavioral switch. Now Orochimaru grinned menacingly. "What shall we talk about?" The real Teiya had body flickered out of her private changing area during the midst of all those washing and grooming jutsus meant to make her look nice, so the chakra trace of her disappearance was lost in the haze. She'd also created a shadow clone to leave behind. The Naruto who'd encountered the Snake Sunin's group was already a clone, so did not have to plan so elaborate an escape. The clones would then remain to engage the invaders in conversation. It was amazing what you could learn from even guarded enemies that way, and with Teiya to expand on and expound the points raised, they were learning a lot, and quickly, about the inner operations of Orochimaru's organization. Not having used the cursed seal removal technique in front of him, the pale man was slightly less murderous, but only slightly. Their clones would usually end up dying before an hour had passed. Naruto was still working on how to trick or wheedle a jutsu or two out of the legendary missing ninja or his entourage, besides Teiya, of course, who was already eagerly sharing her prized techniques with the clan. Stripped of all of her stage magic and non-essential trappings, what she had was a way to create puppets out of pure chakra, formed however she wished, and control them at a distance and indirectly through coded musical notes. It was a devastating technique. Lee. Guy-sensei. Kiba was shaking his head. I never thought I'd see the day when Guy and Lee were prizes in a chick fight. Naruto grudgingly nodded. Yeah. I gotta admit I never thought that we'd be hearing that mantra in a girl's voice. Lee. Guy-sensei. Hinata had finally gotten the wood bloodline. She'd only died 6 times during the experiments to find a way to activate it safely. The regular process of bloodline theft was safe, if you had sufficient skill, which they did, being experts by this point. But the extra stuff needed to take that additional step and grab it out of unliving tissue stripped all of that safety away, and it became a very perilous procedure no matter your skill. Still, as gruesome as that was, and as hard for Naruto to bear, he'd also gotten the wood bloodline, and had only had to die 4 times before they'd discovered a method that gave it to him safely. Having the wood bloodline at last was an event well worth celebrating. So they did. They'd gained one of the most prized bloodlines ever, adding it on top of their Kyuubi bestowed one, and though it was difficult, actually deadly, to perform Orochimaru's post-mortem bloodline theft, it was possible. The process was, by now, well understood by all in Clan Kaiitsuin. The trouble came from the details, all of the fine-tuning to get it just exactly right, made worse that all of the final work was specific to each person. Orochimaru would just blanket a large group and hope that one of them lived, so he could study that success and maybe eventually learn something that could make it safer. But Kaiitsuin clan didn't have that luxury. They wanted, no needed, the process to always work on specific people. Namely themselves. No other subjects were required. In order to grant someone wood techniques, they had to put them through a gruesome experimental process to get it right. There were so many variables that everyone died the first few times they gave the bloodline to them. For a normal clan that would be a complete failure of a technique, but by using the resets and learning from each failed attempt, they could fine-tune details until they eventually got a process that worked for one person. Then they had to start all over to get a process that worked for someone else. What worked on Naruto, to grant him the valuable bloodline, did not for anyone else. The same for the specifics of Hinata's process not being a proper fit for anyone else. They only had to get it to work once per person before they could repeat it precisely to grant the bloodline to them safely, every time. But each person had to go through the gruesome experimental stage for themselves. They supposed that would be different if they had any identical twins to be performing this on. But, as it stood, everyone had a unique set of genetics that had to be carefully accounted for in its own particular way. So far the record low was 4 deaths. A handful of others had matched their husband's record on that. The worst was 9, and didn't want to talk about it, but was very sweet about all she'd gone through to gain it. However, initial success always got followed by testing. Tsunade and Shit soon put them through to verify that the new bloodline was stable and not going to degenerate on them later. They were rigorous by any standards. One could count on one of their deaths just being because of Tsunade trying to get the stolen bloodline to fail after a supposedly successful implant. Which, while unpleasant, no one begrudged her. Naruto's family didn't want to find any unpleasant side effects like sterility or insanity or degeneration anywhere down the road. No uchiharing for this clan. They'd all much rather get those final details ironed out here, when it didn't matter so much, than have the thing fail on them years down the line when they'd thought they were free and clear. In the end, Tsunade pronounced each process a success only once it was as stable as one to which they'd been born naturally. Of course, this was also a great deal of work, so for right now it was restricted to actual members of Clan Kitsune. Making a version that didn't account for the Kyuubi's bloodline decorations would be a whole nother set of calculations no one felt up to doing just yet, and no one without it could, at the moment. During this time, however, another cause for celebration was found, as earned her medical badge for having generalized Naruto's method of regeneration of Lee's chakra coils across a majority of birth defects, curing most of them. Tsunade pronounced the process one of the greatest advances in medicine. But it was also one of those things that would invariably be so popular they could hardly admit to owning it, to prevent wars being fought over them and their knowledge. And they couldn't share it, as the knowledge was too easily adapted into a torture technique that could permanently cripple a person. As if to counter that, Tumrai announced her own happy news, demonstrating that she had discovered a way to generalize Ino's painless childbirth jutsu, by inventing a version that could be applied externally, without taking over the mind of the patient. And, thus, earning her own medic status for having created a technique that could be taught to others, as it did not involve any major world-changing ninja secrets outside of the medical jutsu itself. This doubling of official, Tsunade-approved medics in the clan put pressure on the others to start getting their own projects done. Kin stepped out onto the grass of Wave Country, having just crossed over the Great Naruto Bridge, and found her way to 2 untended graves she'd heard described. Most people in Clan Kitsune knew each other's life stories very well by this point. Hers wasn't very interesting compared to some others, just another young kunoichi trying to make her place in a hostile world. But Naruto. Already the guy had been part of shaping the current ninja world, even if he didn't want to face it. Having personally fought, planned a successful move against, and ultimately participated in the destruction of one of Hidden Mist's legendary 7 swordsmen, was no small accomplishment. But that wasn't what Kin was there for. No, because buried beside that ninja legend was another body, that of a small boy no older than herself, or how old she appeared to be. These resets really caused some confusion over the topic of one's age, and trapped within the genetic code of that buried body was the secrets of the ice bloodline, one of the few that could argue any equality with their newly acquired wood line. That was what Kin was there for. She'd gotten Tsunade's approval for her medical badge if she could restore the lost ice bloodline to their clan. She noted absently that the big sword Zabuza once carried was missing. It had been left there as his headstone, she was told. But it wasn't there now. Still, due to her local guides, she knew these were the right graves. Earthscaping more. She called out a technique after forming the proper hand seals, and the jutsu meant for moving aside enough dirt to create an instant pit trap cleared away the soil to reveal the 2 coffins. Kin looked behind herself and smiled. All right, open them up. Behind stood a well-sprung carriage, beyond the skill of most local artisans. She'd read about it in one of Konoha's library books, a storybook about fairy tales, to be honest, and Naruto had been kind enough to make her one. The 2 wooden horses that stood in the traces, having drawn the thing here, were her own creation. They'd all begun using and experimenting with their newest bloodline as soon as they'd gotten it, and growing instant puppets was one such operation of the technique. Wooden horses were superior to normal ones in that the puppets were both stronger and faster, and they never required any rest. So long as she'd left a shadow clone in the driver's seat to control them, Kin could, and had, traveled the journey in one night and slept through the entire trip. There was a very comfortable bed inside that carriage. Springing from the sides of that carriage, 2 wooden footmen, soldiers really, but also a specific office-like butler, the fetch and carry men of aristocratic households, came down and climbed down into the open pits to open the coffins therein. Then, after doing the preparations themselves so Kin didn't have to get her hands dirty, they sprang back to the carriage, and brought down 2 bound men, thugs left over from Gato's organization that she'd found trying to illegally charge tolls of travelers across the bridge. They were thugs and thieves, charging rent on a property they did not own, but also enemies of her husband, and therefore her family and herself, so Kin felt no remorse at all for what she was about to do to them. She formed a very long series of hand seals, before calling out, "Impure resurrection technique." The 2 leftover bandits collapsed, then rose again moments later as the duo of Zabuza and Haku. "You're a girl," Kin observed in surprise. "I am," Haku admitted, nodding once in confirmation. "But you told my husband, Naruto, you were a boy," Kin objected. On the road, especially without a clan's protection, it drew less attention. Zabuza's raised state volunteered. "So I ordered her to conceal her gender when around others, but to practice in private." "Why?" "There are uses for a mature kunoichi, infiltration and such, that require refined manners and practiced femininity. But such were of no use to us until she was of a proper age to use them. So she practiced in private, but played a boy in public to avoid attracting unwanted complications. The split improved her skills at acting, and were a further benefit on the run, confusing hunter ninja, and so on." Kin thought it over a second, before shrugging and declaring, "Fair enough. You 2, go down and grab your real bodies. I need the genetic data of Haku's, and I promised Anko I'd bring back Zabuza's so she could experiment on him." "Why did you raise us this way?" Zabuza asked, going to do as she'd asked. Kin noted with a quirked eyebrow that Haku deferred to her former leader when he was taking the lead, and remained quiet in the background. "2 reasons, really. One is you are, or were, one of Mist's 7 swordsmen, and while our clan knows one sword style, yours is another, and one we wouldn't mind having, especially if it is as great as tales say. The second is simple, I need Haku's genetic data to try to recreate her bloodline, and thought I could probably get an advantage doing that if I could question her as to specifics. If nothing else, she can teach us her techniques once we do get it copied, so we don't have to reinvent them on our own. We're already doing that last with the first Hokage, raising him to have him teach us his bloodline powers. Copying a bloodline out of dead tissue is impossible," Haku informed her calmly, displaying the medical knowledge Naruto said she'd shown in life. "Not for us," Kin smugly replied, raising her arms to form a hand seal and call out, "Birth of trees." The giant sequoia spring forth out of the ground was proof enough, even if it only did reach about roof height instead of its full potential growth. But her clan were still getting used to the techniques. They had a lot of improvement yet to do. Zabuza had reclosed the coffins and loaded them on the luggage rack, so Kin motioned them inside, while her wooden footman reboarded the conveyance and her shadow clone directed the puppet horses to take the carriage back to Konoha. So Kin had folded the bed out of the way, and was now using it as a bench. "Tell me about yourselves." Zabuza hung his head. "I am roasting in hell for my crimes." Kin gave a pained grimace. "I meant, what were you like in life?" "A sinner who delighted in committing crimes for which I now roast in hell," Zabuza responded. The former sound girl adopted a false smile to cover her grimace. She'd forgotten how distant and remote the subjects of this jutsu were. They didn't use it often, anymore. No real good reasons to, well, except for the first Hokage for reasons already named. Turning to the other girl, she asked, "And how about you?" "I was a tool," Haku stated politely yet woodenly. "She was my servant, so perfectly devoted, pure, kind and loyal that with her unblemished heart she resides in heaven, while I burn in hell," Zabuza mourned. Kin winced. This looked like it was going to be a long trip. "Lee. Guy-sensei. Stop." Naruto waved his hands for silence, interrupting the argument. As he got attention refocused on him, he used his rarely employed executive power to halt the ongoing arguments. "Okay, this is how it's going to happen. We're going to judge by two criteria before any other consideration. First will be ease of access. We want our allies aware of previous memories as early into each reset as possible, and it does no good to assign someone to bring in a person they will have trouble getting to. So, by that measure, Tenten has first dibs on Lee and Guy." "Yes." Tenten vigorously pumped a fist, having been one of those arguing. "Second criteria will be blocks to romance," Naruto declared, shaking his head. "It would be worthless to bring a guy in for 50 resets, only for a girl to fall in love with him and have her foxy protections eject his shelter from her mind, ruining all those memories and experiences he'd accumulated. So, judging by that measure, Tenten loses all rights to Lee, as he's her age and has already been infatuated with her." "Oh." The weapons mistress mourned, dropping. "But he's my closest friend outside the clan." "That's exactly our problem," Anko agreed over folded arms. "Other than already being taken, you have no barriers against falling in love with Lee. So, to prevent future complications, you shouldn't be the one bringing him in." "Exactly," Naruto agreed firmly. Then, turning to Tenten, he said, "So, if you want to bring in Guy, he's yours. We'll count the age difference and teacher-student relationship, coupled with his honor not to abuse that, as a barrier against romance, and therefore a safe bet." The girl considered for a moment before nodding brightly. "All right. And, by the same token, Tumrai has access to Gaara, and we'll count their being brother and sister an excellent barrier," Naruto continued evenly. People were nodding, coming to accept that things were being resolved fairly, if not exactly how they would have liked them to be. "Sorry, not possible." All eyes turned round to face the Kyuubi, who'd spoken, and who elaborated as soon as she had their attention. "People can only be brought into the resets by placing them under my aegis, so to speak. And Gaara has his own demon. I may be more powerful than Shukaku, but not enough to subdue him utterly, which is what it would take to shelter his container." "Sorry." "Okay," Naruto sighed. "So no Gaara. That's bad, as I was sort of counting on him. But okay, we can deal with that. Tumrai can bring in Kankuro instead. He's still a strong fighter, a reasonable mind, and a good guy. I like him, and want him in the resets." Kandutamrai nodded agreeably, then smiled. To tell the truth, Kankuro is going to be easier for me. We may argue, but he's sane. I've always known he'd back me in the end. Gara would be a struggle to trust sufficiently. She got several nods of fervent acknowledgement of her point. Hana already has Kiba Naruto plowed on. So that's taken care of, and I'm glad to have him in. Kiba smiled at the acceptance of the alpha male. It meant more than anyone outside an Inuzuka could possibly believe. I could bring in Shino. Hinata volunteered. Sorry, not possible. Once again, all eyes turned to Kyubi, who rolled over and lounged. But why not? He's trustworthy, and I like him as a friend, Hinata protested before facing her husband. Plus, as my teammate I have easy access, and I find his bugs too a key for any romance potential. As if there was any chance of that, half the clan thought aloud. Hinata was almost proverbial in her devotion to Naruto. Because Shino is an Aburam, and they are not one, they are many, Kyubi answered with a yawn. The pathways you might use to tap a linkage into his mind are the same ones his clan have adapted to link to their bug symbiotes. So that port is already taken, so to speak. You'd have to kill off his bug swarms to get him, and he would not take kindly to that, if he survived the trauma of their loss. Oh, everyone sagged, a little depressed. He would have been a good ally to have, too. Not only for his own potential, which was great, but for the fact that it could have brought teammate complete into the resets, dropping awkward moments significantly. Team Guy had a similar hang-up. Where soon they hoped to have Guy himself, plus Lee, and they had already had Tenten since practically the start of the clan. Neji was just out of the question. No one liked or trusted him, least of all his cousin Hinata. Neji went out of his way to not be a likable person. Naruto started scratching his head. Well, can bring in her dad, at least. I think I made a mistake. This is not about closing out a story. That will happen on its own. The labor I am to perform here is to have fun, and to bring you all there to share it with me. Anything else is a waste. Actually, having taken a brief break, I find I'm all afire with fresh ideas again. Besides, rushing this to completion is only possible if I neglect to spend any screen time developing the side characters I am only now introducing, and that, I think, would be an error. So, Anko. Kin walked into the no longer secret underground lab, calling, I know why we wanted Haku, who, as it turns out, is a girl. But why were you so interested in my bringing back Zabuza's corpse? Zabuza, reanimated by the impure resurrection technique, followed in after carrying the coffin that contained his original body. Haku's was already in the corner of the secret lab where the gene stealing was going to be done. Another project of Rocha-chan's, Anko shrugged, looking up from her work doing so. I figured Hinata had such success with hers, and she did help out the clan greatly, that I could do the same. Bring one of my old teacher's discarded projects to life and make it into something that could help us all out in the future, and perhaps earn my medical badge in the bargain. Kin blinked. I thought you couldn't recall those years. Anko grimaced. I was no longer able to put up with wondering about my past. I needed answers, so I had to delve into my memories to open up the blocks that were put in there over the period of my apprenticeship to Rocha-chan. Frankly, though they seemed bad at the time, it was worse not knowing what it was I'd been up to as his student. So, what project are you working on? Kin leaned closer to look. One of the many routes the traitor Sunin pursued trying to find a path to immortality, Anko answered. There weren't many who'd succeeded at this before him, so he had more theories than facts about what to pursue. So, as usual with him, he devoted effort into them all before he found a route that promised success, then abandoned all others. Kin resumed blinking. So, you've found a secret to eternal youth? No, not actually. The special Jonin grinned up at the former sound ninja. That was never much of a part of his quest. Rocha-chan was always more interested in the how do I live through the destruction of my body type of living forever, since he's always been a bit reckless in combat. Besides, we already have the eternal youth part covered through our decorations. Kin was nodding. Yeah, once I understood the situation, I have to admit that I pretty much expected the QB decorations to include a component like that. After all, she doesn't want Naruto to die on her, so it only makes sense that her revisions to his body would have some way to keep it in optimal condition indefinitely. Since she seems to be playing straight with her actions for now, all us female clan members got the same enhancements, so our bodies will end up in optimal condition indefinitely as well. Which the young Kunoichi smoothed down the shirt against her young and trim sides. I have to admit is not the least of my joys over being a part of this clan. Anko snorted. You ought to have seen the rest of us when we figured that out. We took the opportunity to get Kyuubi another rather extended grooming session with Naruto, strictly as a personal thank you gift from our side. I know that Naruto never minds doing that for one of his ladies. Kin gave a happy bounce. I can't say I'd mind more myself, but she fluffed out her hair, as I am not personally responsible for seeing to it that our clan will probably outlive Konoha. Yeah. I'd say she deserved it. Anko spent a moment in sober thought over that. There'd always been ninja organizations, but they got destroyed or remade at fairly even intervals, historically speaking, and nobody stayed on top for long. Konoha was actually coming to the end of the historical average for anyone holding the top dog position, and the expected rot and corruption of an aged champion on its way out had already set in, with council members and clans more concerned about petty self-interests than in preserving the village. It was a thought that bore thinking on. Nothing was more certain in history than people getting overrun the moment they're sure they couldn't be. The moment you thought you were so strong that you couldn't be defeated, you got beaten by somebody. It occurred so often in history that it was like some cosmic joke, or something. Now the idea of outliving Konoha had occurred to her. Anko had to admit that not only did she like the idea, but they, as a clan, ought to investigate going into some serious efforts to ensure that. Because Konoha was nearing the end of its expected lifespan, but their clan was only just starting out. So, what are you making? Can I help? Kin leaned over to ask. Anko shook herself out of such thoughts. Sure. I could use a fresh mind on this problem. You already know of our projects looking into the various types of elemental clones. Well, Orochimaru had already found out the secrets of most of those, and he'd had a brilliant intuitive leap. He thought of creating a clone, not out of chakra elements, but out of medical means. Ha! Kin was lost on that little turnabout. Anko smiled back at her. A clone made out of flesh and blood, grown instead of summoned. Not a chakra construct, but an actual living body created via advanced medical techniques, as real as the one you were born with. It was his hope to hop from body to body, and at first he'd thought to use his own. The Sound Maiden was now blinking in amazement. Well. So how far did he get with that? The dark-haired special Jonin went back to scowling over her sparse work notes. Creating flesh clones. Nowhere, unfortunately. He'd sobered up in the morning and forgot about the whole deal. I'm having to start on this from scratch. But before he passed out from too much liquor, he'd speculated that this could turn our impure resurrection technique into a pure one because the spirit would have a copy of its own living body to inhabit. Anko shrugged. It's the same line of thought that eventually led him to what he's doing now, a spirit that jumps from body to body as the old ones get damaged beyond the reasonable ability to repair. With this, he was going to use multiple younger and whole copies of his own body. But he ended up using other people's, because of the added bonus of throwing their bloodlines and special powers onto the heap with his. And Zabuza is going to be your experimental model for this. Kin blinked in shock, then called out back over her shoulder. You hear that, demon boy? Anko here is working on a way to drag your sorry spirit out of hell. So you could be immortal again. The body animated by the legendary swordsman's spirit was suddenly kneeling before Anko in a position of utmost humility. Redeem my soul from hell, and I shall be your devoted servant. I shall live as Haku did, to be redeemed from my countless crimes. Anko looked up at Kin and smirked. Well, that's promising. The Kitesun clan compound was, as always, awash in activity. There were clones everywhere performing techniques, practicing skills, and generally busy with the everyday activities of ninja life. Over in one of the massive courtyards a group of clones were listening to the impure resurrected form of the first Hokage teach them about his bloodline powers, getting tutoring in his gift and asking questions on techniques. Over in another courtyard, the impure resurrected form of the second Hokage was teaching people what he could of his impressive water abilities, while Shitsune evaluated whether that was a bloodline gift they could copy. They hoped it was, and things were looking promising. Lately a new crowd had formed, and the fourth Hokage's animated body was doing some tutoring of his own. The reason for this was very simple. Naruto was his son, and the pattern he once used to get that fact revealed to the village was no longer something they could duplicate. It had required Kuinai's unwitting assistance back before she'd joined in the resets, and so it was not a pattern she recalled or could duplicate. She hadn't even lived through it before being awakened, and that made replicating that pattern precisely monstrously difficult. Sarutobi, the third Hokage, was a shrewd judge of character, and Naruto was the only one they knew who could act convincingly enough to fool the old guy. Kuinai could, and had, tried going through the motions as Naruto told her the lines she'd once used, but the results had not convinced the old guy. This despite months spent in practice, getting coached by Naruto and refining it all in active practice during live attempts to convince their Hokage. It was a very exacting set of cues and leads that eventually got the current village leader to let slip who Kakashi's former teacher was. Naruto was adroit enough to duplicate things to that level of exactness, but no one else was, and a big part of that conversation depended on Kuinai. Without Sarutobi dropping that little hint, the pattern they knew for getting that information released to the village at large didn't work. If Naruto told anybody, the Hokage let the village council discipline him for spreading false rumors. And if anybody else said a word they got executed. It was a secret their current Hokage was willing to kill for. Apparently he was that certain it was needed for keeping Naruto safe from his father's foes. Who knew? He could even be right. The clan didn't exactly have any long-range predictive ability for repercussions to events outside of the resets. But the point was, they didn't care. Their Naruto was not some ignorant genin or dead last, like the Hokage felt he was. The resets had refined him to the point that if the secret could ever be revealed, it was safe to do so now. And really, surrendering happiness and freedom in exchange for safety was generally a poor choice in any case, as things never turned out how you wanted them to. Preserving a life, only to make that life not worth living, was not any sort of gain or accomplishment. The Uchiha had enemies as well, yet no one shoved Sasuke so far down into a disguise that he'd been hated and warped by abuse and misery. Although Sasuke was a bad example, as he'd chosen to delve into misery on his own. A classic case of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. The last Uchiha had all of the tools for a happy life, admiration of others and kindness, but he'd chosen not to permit himself happiness. However, he'd made that choice himself. No one had done it to him. Still, they'd needed another plan for how to reveal to the village that Naruto was the son of their most beloved Hokage. Until they could do that, the hate and unreasoning anger the village felt against him would not abate, and that meant no Chunin promotion for the lad. Ironically, they were now in almost the reverse position of the one they'd had before. For a great many resets Naruto had a system where he could get the village to like him enough to allow his promotion, but couldn't deal effectively with the invasion or Orochimaru. Now they knew a dirty trick whereby they could reliably kill the stinking pedophile, using his own arrogance against him, but the route that once worked to achieve the appreciation of the village so he could get a Chunin promotion was no longer valid. Strange are the twists of fate. One of their preferred notions was to get Naruto acting close enough to the fourth for the resemblance to take hold in and of itself and create some spark they could then expand on. That included acting and dressing like his dad, but it also had to extend to fighting like his dad, and that meant Naruto had to learn his father's techniques. Spiraling sphere was simple. Jiraiya was so easy to get addicted to the sexy paradise illusion that any time they wanted to they could effectively reduce the Toad Son into Naruto's slave. Since the super pervert knew how to use the fourth's legendary attack, he could teach it to the clan no problem. The problem came in the other half of the Yellow Flash's unbeatable combo, the speed technique that enabled him to slaughter 1,000 rock ninja with his unbeatable attack. The Flying Thunder God technique that gave the Yellow Flash his name was not available on any scroll they knew of, nor did the Toad Sannin know how to use it. The one time Sarutobi tried to pass on Naruto's inheritance, it had been discovered that the scrolls that had once been supposed to be part of it had been stolen long ago. That no one had been heard of using the fourth Hokage's techniques said that whatever security seals or codes had been on the scrolls themselves had probably worked, perhaps even destroyed them, sealing the secrets of those techniques forever. So, for all anyone could tell, that secret had died with the fourth Hokage. So they'd brought him back to make him teach them. It seemed pretty simple and straightforward to the members of Clan Kitsune. If only the fourth knew it, and only the fourth could teach it, then he would teach them. In spite of being dead. There was a lesson to be learned there. In fact, it opened wide possibilities that even Naruto's new family were not sure they were quite willing to take. The possibility was that no technique could truly be lost so long as they knew of a dead guy who'd once used it. Thankfully, availability of bodies was somewhat limited, otherwise they could use this to learn every technique ever practiced in the ninja world. As it was, however, ninja routinely destroyed the bodies of their fallen comrades lest the secrets of their village be unlocked by enemies studying their corpses. Even with the rare exceptions, there weren't all that many bodies to find. Thankfully, they had a few. "You know I worry about him," Hana told Shitsune, watching Naruto practice under the tutelage of the animated fourth Hokage. "That's his father out there, and..." The Inuzuka heiress sighed. The Slug Sannin's apprentice shook her head softly. "No, not really. It isn't the same. The impure resurrection technique gives us only a narrow window into what the man truly was. It's more like a puppet influenced by a dead man than a living, breathing person. Something's there, but it isn't the same. Hana folded her arms, still looking on the scene. But still, it isn't good for a boy, an orphan at that, to have so little reaction to his father like that. The more experienced medic drew in a deep breath, then let it out again. I'd say you're right, but we have a few factors complicating things. On the one hand, Naruto ought to be furious. His father left him with nothing, no family, no house, no money, no one to care for him, none of what truly matters to a young child, or what they need growing up, did his father provide. Naruto was left in the harshest of all possible environments to develop in, and it has stunted him still. There's all sorts of things our husband is still overcoming, left as relics of that extremely harsh and lonely childhood. Hana scowled herself. Family was pack, and you didn't turn your back on it. A failure to uphold one's pack was unforgivable, the most serious failure anyone could ever perform, worse than murder and worse than treason. There are a number of people who are responsible for that, she growled. Shitsune nodded sadly. Yes, Sarutobi is a big one. He was responsible for the secret of the Kyuubi getting out, which led to all of the hatred. He tried to put a lid on it with that law of his, but it didn't do anything useful. That cat was already out of the bag. The village blamed Naruto for the loss of their beloved fourth Hokage, the damage caused by the Kyuubi, and just about everything else that went wrong at the time. Then Sarutobi is responsible for trying to keep Naruto's parentage a secret, which was just about the only thing that could have stopped all of that hatred from forming. So the situation as it exists was more or less authored by Sarutobi. Hana's grimace slipped, then she dropped her head. I could hate him for that, but I know he honestly thought he was doing best. Foolishness isn't the same as treason, in spite of the fact that it can do more harm, sometimes. Shitsune's lips grew thin. The person I blame most is Jiraiya. He is Naruto's godfather, and the only purpose or reason for the existence of the role of godfather is to take over the role of father should the child's parents ever lose their ability to care for it. That's been the one job of godfather for the entirety of recorded history, stretching back thousands of years. 1. That Jiraiya ran away from his responsibilities, leaving Naruto with nothing instead of raising the boy himself, is nothing short of reprehensible. It is an utter and complete betrayal of trust, not only that he effectively left him to die, alone among a village full of enemies, but that when Jiraiya came back he refused to give Naruto any training without being bribed for it. Legally, he is the closest thing to a father Naruto has, and you shouldn't have to parade a naked body in front of your father to get him to teach you anything. So we gelled him, Hana stated. At least Shitsune answered seriously. Even if you want to grant that he could not take care of a kid himself, which is not true, as he spent most of his time lazing around and partying instead of in any real danger, then he still had responsibility for arranging Naruto's care and he didn't even bother to do that. It's no wonder, in light of all he's learned, that Naruto has trust issues with authority figures after discovering things like that. He's never truly had an authority figure who was deserving of trust. Even Sarutobi could have done more than gone out with him for ramen once a month, no matter what disguise or appearance he wanted to be maintaining. A leader is allowed to take note when an orphan is being abused, and do something about it. Hana growled in the back of her throat. Shitsune formed a fist. And then we come back to Kakashi. The man was a student of Naruto's father, so had spent enough time with him he had no real excuse not to notice the resemblance. But even if you grant him that, say he had no interest in the boy before becoming his teacher, he darn well should have suspected something after being named Naruto's Chunin instructor. The name Uzumaki was only ever held by one other person in this village, and he'd been close enough to the fourth to know who he was dating. Kakashi shows a criminal disinterest in his student to have not figured out Naruto was the son of his own teacher. Anyone with any situational awareness at all could have figured that one out. He wouldn't even have had to look too deeply. His own life experiences should have provided all of the evidence that he needed, and Kakashi spends all of his time musing on his past. The apprentice to the slug son invisibly tried to calm herself. Kakashi has no excuse for not knowing, if not originally, then later. And knowing, he had a responsibility to help out. As his father's friend and student, Kakashi was next in line for being the adult responsible for caring for Naruto through his life. Heck! He didn't even have to do that. All he'd have had to do was his job. If he'd been even a halfway decent teacher to Naruto, our husband would not have developed the trust issues he's facing now. And without that, he'd be able to enjoy the presence of his own father, even if it is in impure form. Hannah looked over to her friend and sister via marriage. Hey, I'm going to go kill someone brutally. Want to come along? Sure. Shitsune shot her back a grin, before they both disappeared. The bodies of Jiraiya and Kakashi would later be discovered, having been put to death in some of the most agonizing ways imaginable. Ironically, the assassination of a couple high-ranking Konoha ninja put that town on alert, and thus far more ready to counter the sand-forward/sound invasion. Contrary to popular opinion, Guy and Lee did not spend every waking moment shouting about the power of youth. This is not to say they were sober, serious shinobi, but they did have their quiet moments when things had to pause and be considered. Then they could go back to the sport chants and ridiculous physical training levels. One of those quiet moments was occurring right now, at the Kitsune clan compound, after the two had been led through on a very loud, guided tour of the facilities where the two fitness nuts had seen the chakra training, the sparring, people practicing Zabuza's sword techniques and receiving tutoring from the various Hokages. Guy and Lee had immediately noted, and complained about, the lack of extreme physical fitness training, but even that had been explained. They'd even seen the forges where Zabuza's animated self had been guiding Naruto into somewhat more accurate copies of his gigantic sword. The trio of Naruto, Guy and Lee had paused in the forges where Naruto had intended to outfit the pair of new recruits with armor. But they'd run into some immediate snags there, as well. No. Guy crushed an armored breastplate in his fist and tossed it away. I cannot wear something so unyouthful. I would tear it apart like a set of pajamas the moment I got going. The pajamas thing is actually kind of the point. Naruto tilted his head. It had to be lightweight and flexible enough for us to wear it. Indeed, Naruto's original armor designs would have been both heavier and stronger, save for the fact that those who wore it could not bear very much weight. So sacrifices had had to be made in order to preserve mobility and maximize flexibility. It turned out Guy and Lee wanted much heavier armor, increased protection mostly, but they weren't afraid of heaviness, considering they played with weights that would flatten most Chunin. To demonstrate his teacher's point, Lee took hold on one of those armored plates and tore it like tissue paper. So Naruto designed a much heavier style of armor. He kept the articulation, so one could still move and stay flexible within it, provided greatly increased weight couldn't slow you down, which, for anyone but Guy and Lee, it would. But the strength monsters could bound around like butterflies in it, and if they were slowed at all, only they could tell. But the protection of the new sets was so much superior that soon everyone wanted one, planning to get strong enough to use them later, after the loops had ended. But then Guy suggested reversed weight seals. Instead of making an object heavier to train under, it made it lighter, so even the gentlest and slenderest of Naruto's wives could use the much heavier armor styles right away, rather than later. And so they did, and in the process gained a degree of protection that would have impressed anyone. The old sets, the extremely lightweight ones, could have been penetrated by a good blow by a strong arm. The new ones. Forget it. If it wasn't an optimized armor-piercing weapon, it stood no chance. Unless you were facing a close combat specialist, Zabuza, Guy and Lee representing the extreme case of such individuals, the new armor could effectively ignore most purely physical attacks. And that was just the way they liked it. Of course, that still left them vulnerable to chakra or elemental techniques, illusions, tricks, traps and so on. Explosive notes could crush you despite your armor. And then, of course, there were giant summon monsters who could squash armored ninja like ants. So they were still far from safe. But they were much, much closer. There were inevitable weak points, of course. A long, furry tail is almost impossible to armor properly, as are parabolic ears. Because of them, there were places where a canny attacker could make a telling strike even without great strength or specialty weapons. But no one has ever died from getting a bit shaved off one ear. Well, there was Van Gogh, but painters don't count. In spite of Naruto's family all knowing how to paint. After much labor in the workshop getting the new armor heavy and strong enough to meet the pair's approval, Naruto led the duo out to have lunch. A picnic was already laid out for the entire clan on blankets, where they all had an excellent view of the new Hokage monument. It had been carved up, replacing the former faces with Guy and Lee in their nice guy poses, teeth somehow glinting and thumbs up, with a banner carved beneath them reading, "Welcome Guy and Lee." Yugao stood before an audience consisting of Clan Kitsune, plus Kiba, Guy, Lee and Sakura, and strode before the large war maps hanging behind her. She was in the midst of a lecture on their spy situation. Konoha has never been very good at information gathering. Our position as the strongest village has led to some degree of arrogance. Even some Jonin feel it hardly matters what the other villages are up to, that's a mistake. It leads to unpleasant surprises, things like this sand-forward/sound invasion. She used a swagger stick to point, indicating the position of the attacking forces, as they'd be when it came time for the invasion. Then she snorted. Besides, information gathering missions aren't glamorous. A good one is actually quite boring, so adrenaline junkies sneer at them. But they also don't pay anything, as the client is Konoha itself. Much more profitable in the short term to use our ninja on paying missions. But it costs us in the long run. Yugao took a deep sigh and shook her head sadly. Also, deep cover is where the real gold mines of information are, and we are too tender-hearted to do that to many of our kunoichi. I can't say I mind that policy, as it's pretty callous to throw away your ninjas' lives on missions like that, where even if they succeed their lives are ruined and they are gone forever, but it does cost us in the intelligence department. The Jonin sword's mistress and Anbu parked her swagger stick on a shoulder. Sand is far more ruthless than we are, and has a much better intelligence setup. When their daimyo demanded they reduce their ninja forces, sending those missions he wanted done off to Konoha, the Kazekage selected only the weakest shinobi to be eliminated, and took them off the rolls of active duty by condemning them to deep cover assignments. It paid off. Although quite a number of those agents have been killed or captured over the years, they still have some of the best information sources out there among any of the 5 major villages. Konoha has relied on our allies' intelligence network for years to supplement our own rather weak one. Heck, if it wasn't for Jiraiya running his own independent setup, or information passed on to us by Sand, Konoha wouldn't have anything worth calling a spy network. It's there, we couldn't call ourselves a ninja village if we didn't make any rudimentary efforts, but not good enough to stop us from being blindsided by events. And an invasion is a pretty major event to have not seen at all. Yugao used her swagger stick to wave toward a second board, this one covered by pictures of Kabuto and other traitors. Of course, as can be observed by how deeply Orochimaru has us penetrated, we can be said to suck even worse on counter-espionage. The secrets of Konoha aren't very secret to the other ninja villages, who have a disturbingly accurate picture of the major events that go on in our home. That information makes their ninjas stand out less when they visit us, and that in turn makes us easier for them to infiltrate. It's a steady cycle. The more they know about us, the better their penetration efforts go, and the more they can know about us. To be frank, we've got more undercover work going on here than most brothels. And all of it is targeted against the integrity of this village. The Chunin turned back to face her audience and sighed, holding both ends of her swagger stick and bending it slightly. Even should we eliminate our entire current crop of spies and enemy infiltrators, Konoha would not be secure. Too many villages have too complete, and too recent ideas about our activities. They would be able to infiltrate us again. Of course, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but you must understand that even as thorough a house cleaning as the resets offer us isn't going to be enough on its own. We must also figure out a way to stop the flow of new spies coming in to replace the ones we eliminate. Yugao walked to her podium and set down the swagger stick. That concludes this briefing. Any questions? Hinata raised her hand. On being called on, she stood up, shining with brilliant trust in their mutual husband. Konoha is only a village, and Naruto already knows most of the people in it by sight. Why don't we have him memorize the faces of everyone else? That way, when strangers arrive, we'd be better able to identify them. Hana stood up. We rely on Naruto to do too much for us already. You've got a good plan, but we can handle at least part of the load ourselves. Most of us know a sizable portion of this village now. I'd bet even Tamrai knows more of Konoha's citizens than she does of Suna's, by this point. Also, Anko put a measure forth to have unpredictable actions as part of every other reset. What I now propose is that we take advantage of this opportunity to combine the two. Every reset, we should have some games of hunt and seek, where we select names at random from the civilian roster, pretend they are enemy shinobi, study them as if they were targets and go find them. Each one of us can pursue her own, or we can do them together. It won't take us but a few years to have a good general familiarity with everyone. Anko also stood. This is based on my idea, so I ought to add, we should make sure that each and every one of us knows all Konoha ninja by sight and abilities. Essentially, you should all have a complete mental set of nin info cards on your fellow shinobi. What we don't know can and has hurt us before, and knowing who could be relied on for what makes us more flexible. Also, when Naruto gets to be Hokage, it could be a big help to him to know all of the shinobi under his command. Ino agreed, showing only slightly less brilliant trust in their mutual husband than Hinata. It was still early morning, and the last Uchiha was sleeping like a log, utterly and completely oblivious to any danger, safe in the apartment he had moved into after he'd sold the Uchiha clan compound to the village in a deal with the Hokage. Sasuke slept heavily, so confident in his superior ninja skills that he never imagined anyone could possibly do him harm. That sort of arrogance gets people killed. Ino and Yugao appeared in his room, and the purple-haired Anbu leaned close to her comrade to whisper in her ear, while Ino was paralyzing and sedating the Uchiha. Okay, now will you tell me what we are up to? There isn't anyone to listen in. Ino grinned back at her. We're going to practice up new techniques to get you your medical badge, like I promised. Yugao blinked down at the boy Ino had paralyzed. So, why are we doing this with the Uchiha? Ino's grin was downright feral. What we're about to do is both immoral and unethical, and we wouldn't want to hurt anyone we might actually care about. That made Sajuke the perfect test subject. Cruelty to Uchihas is not cruelty at all. I'll send one of my clones to take all of his tests for him. And what is it we are testing? The lovely Anbu inquired. A method for manufacturing deep cover agents, Ino replied. It was his obsession with his older brother that gave me the idea. An obsessed mind is an unhealthy one, and an unhealthy mind is a weak one. We can theoretically use a brainwashing technique to suppress that weak mind and overlay it with a personality of our choosing, thus destroying Sajuke and turning him into a new person. Our overlay won't have any skills to speak of, but that's where the second part of this comes in. Yugao crossed her arms, staring derisively down at the test patient. I can't possibly imagine a use for him as deep cover. His face is too well known. And if he has no memories or techniques, how is he going to disguise himself? He won't. Ino returned eagerly. We'll do all of the disguising right here. I got this idea from our bloodline theft techniques. We simply take a genetic template and overwrite his own, just like we're doing with memories. His own genes will be completely altered into something else, and then we can explore new medical techniques for changing his appearance to match. The Anbu blinked. That's actually impressive. Better still, it destroys the Sharingan. And without that, nobody will ever think of Sajuke as important. Ino's face hardened. Frankly, that's what motivated me to try this in the first place. He's led too many girls along and walked over too many people's lives in this town. His mind is full of filth, and I hate him for having once tricked me into admiring him. Revenge against Sajuke aside, what do we hope to accomplish with this technique? Yugao leaned forward to ask. The blonde girl smirked wickedly. Manufacture of disposable deep cover agents, of course. That's the single worst duty for ninja to perform, other than the truly wicked stuff the Hokage doesn't accept as missions, like the assassination of innocents. Anyway, somebody has to do deep cover, so I was thinking why not make our enemies do it for us. We take someone like Sajuke here, whom none of us care whether he lives or dies, and transform him medically into a person other villages won't recognize as a ninja. But we leave subconscious commands underlaying the surface personality to find out and relay the kind of information we want. The Anbu's face whitened. Actually, that's a scary concept. What if our enemies learn that technique and use it on one of us? I don't think that's possible. Not on any of us. Orochimaru already has the mental parts of this working with the hidden commands and so on. Teiya was just revealing that to us earlier. Konoha has a dozen or so citizens who didn't even know they were spying on us. But none of those were ninja. Too much mental energy makes a technique like this impossible. So civilians only. So not even Anko, who Orochimaru was able to work on for a long time, could have had this done to her. That's because none of us have exceptionally weak minds, like Sajuke does. Yes, but what if he improves the techniques? Yugao raised an eyebrow. Ino shrugged, bouncing her yellow hair. It's something my family techniques can be used to test for. We just weren't looking, although you can be sure that's changed now. Anyway, she tossed her hair. We'll just have to create some defenses against this sort of thing. Brainwashing techniques already exist, and are used by lots of villages, so it's not like there is no danger. That part isn't even new. No, the only aspect of this that's different is that we'll be developing medical techniques for changing a person's outward appearance, instead of relying on disguises that can be seen through. I mean, if we do this right, then not even a Sharingan or Hyuga could see through the illusion of the new face. Because it won't be an illusion, it'll be real flesh. The Yamanaka girl smirked evilly. So it won't matter that the new person we make out of Sasuke won't have any skills, because we can turn him into any old random peasant. No one will expect him to have any skills. Just another wandering orphan seeking for a place to settle down. He can pitch manure in some place, and if anyone tests him for ninja powers, they won't find any, no matter how hard they interrogate him. Because he won't have any. Yugao was nodding, then grew serious. But what if we fail? Ino grinned happily. Then we'll still have had a chance to perform horrible medical experiments on Sasuke, which counts as a win in my books. Neji Hyuga woke up the morning of his first Chunin exam test, got ready and got dressed in his typical attire of medium sleeve light grey jacket with the high collar and black knee-length shorts. The only spots of color were his blue ninja sandals and the Konoha headband he wore to cover the cursed seal on his forehead. All functional. His long, straight black hair grown out to about mid-back was his one concession to pride. So wrapped up was Neji in his contemplations of the upcoming Chunin tests that he did not note Hinata when she passed by him on his way out of the Hyuga compound to meet his team. For one thing, she hardly acted like his main branch cousin in the slightest, moving and holding herself with a level of confidence that her father couldn't match. The Hyuga clan head had too much of a chip on his shoulder to act that confident and sure of himself. For another, she wasn't dressed as he'd grown accustomed to Hinata being dressed, in a thick jacket and blue calf-length pants. No. For some strange reason she was wearing a medium-sleeve light grey jacket with high collar and black knee-length shorts. Although she'd retained her standard blue ninja sandals, her headband was worn around her forehead instead of around her neck. Her blue hair was also grown long, to about her mid-back. So, preoccupied as he was, Neji didn't recognize her. Instead, the poor genin was busy bracing himself for the standard, expected reaction when he met his team, psyching himself up against the spandex-wearing duo with those ridiculous haircuts and oversized eyebrows shouting about the power of youth. And in all other ways being annoying obstacles to his progress. Instead, the Hyuga prodigy came to a shocked halt as he spotted the green beast of Konoha and Lee, who was practically his clone. Both of them looked up at him from where they'd been waiting, hands in the pockets of their medium-sleeve light grey jacket with high collars. He couldn't help but notice the black knee-length shorts, blue ninja sandals, or that each had somehow, miraculously grown their hair out of those horrid bowl cuts into long, straight styles that reached about their mid-backs. Gone were the green spandex, orange leg warmers and wristbands, bowl cuts and everything that made the freaks stand out so horribly. Even the stupid grins were missing, replaced by copies of his own blank, stoic expression. Startled for a moment, Neji calmed himself, the opinion he had of the duo dropping at this obvious prank on him. But he wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Hi Neji." Then Tenten trotted up, and gone were the Chinese silks or buns in her hair. Instead, for some strange reason she was wearing the same light grey jacket with high collar, black shorts, and hairstyle as everyone else. Correcting his battle stance, assumed in the shock of their meeting, Neji nodded to her stiffly and tried to pretend everything was normal. Remember, Guy turned a stiff and stoic gaze upon his students. Hard work is meaningless. Either you are fated to become Chunin, or you are not. Bow to the whims of fate, and accept its inevitability. It is pointless to fight against one's destiny. Lee nodded soberly, with an utterly straight face. Neji's hands were clenched into fists by the time their teacher body flickered away. Glowering at his teammates, but relieved their prank was over, Neji walked away in something of an angry huff, only to get practically run over by a pink-haired girl who, he noted, was wearing another set of copies of his clothes, and her pink hair was worn long, straight, and to her mid-back. Eye twitching, the Hyuga genius plodded on angrily to the test center, only to stop and stare as Kuinai's teammate crossed his path, and every member of it, from the Jonin sensei on down to Kiba's dog, were all wearing identical copies of his own signature attire. Funny, but he'd never noticed before how much Shino's coat and pants resembled his own. Veins were popping on Neji's forehead as they walked on, only for a call out of a ramen shop to distract his attention, causing him to notice the waitress and chef were also wearing medium-sleeve light grey jackets with high collar and black knee-length shorts, their hair worn long and straight, down to their mid-backs. The boys' eyebrows both started twitching as they began passing other teams from other villages, and one of those foreign ninja had the kunoichi on their team wearing practically an identical copy of his own attire. This went beyond a joke. He couldn't imagine how anyone could get a maiden of sound, who'd never been to Konoha before, wearing his clothes. The Hyuga prodigy activated his white eyes, but couldn't detect an illusion. Then he practically got run over by the team from Sand, and the girl made his outfit look so good he could almost forget about her two brothers, one with a puppet strapped over his back, wearing the same medium-sleeve light grey jacket with high collar and black knee-length shorts as the boy carrying it, and the other wearing a great big gourd over his medium-sleeve light grey jacket with high collar and black knee-length shorts. All of their hair was long, straight, and hanging down to their mid-backs. Neji was standing in the middle of the street, fists clenched and fuming, when Lee came up on his elbow and declared, in his own sober, straight-laced and dangerous monotone, "Come inside. We are not fated to miss this Chunin test. It is our destiny to be on time." Neji almost slugged him for that. The Hyuga prodigy stormed angrily in the front doors of the test center, and this time he noticed his cousin Hinata hanging out with her team, all of them wearing his outfits. It was only the third time he'd seen her that morning. Neji could have stopped and said something, but he got cut off by a tide of orange clones streaming past, all of them wearing medium-sleeve jackets with high collars and black knee-length shorts, blonde hair worn straight and down to their mid-backs, only the jackets this time were orange. The orange clones met up with the pink-haired girl and a boy, the Uchiha prodigy, who was thankfully not dressed up as a Neji clone. Then that team all streamed inside rather quickly. But somehow in the press, Hinata's team had also vanished, and he'd missed his opportunity to confront her. There were Chunin guarding the door, and Neji noted with a small amount of wonder that someone had also gotten them wearing copies of his signature attire. Storming in past them, the boy rammed his way past other people dressed like him and shoved open the doors to the test area, where every single face turned up to look at him, and from the proctors on down, every single person was wearing copies of his clothes. The head examiner nodded to him. "It's good to see you in regulation attire. Now sit. Those of you who are destined to pass will pass. Those who are destined to fail will fail. Be still, and contemplate fate." The Hyuga prodigy's head was hurting as he sat, and looked out the window, only to fall down in shock on noticing the Hokage monument had been changed so every single face there was looking down at him over his own style of high collar, long hair, and headbands worn as if concealing cursed marks. Neji Hyuga. Fail. The head examiner called, hands stuffed deeply into the pockets of the medium sleeve, light grey jacket he was wearing over his black, knee-length shorts. It is obviously not your fate to become Chunin. Take away his uniform. The shocked Hyuga was picked up off the floor by two Chunin proctors dressed in identical clothes to his, and carried away stunned amid mutters about how obviously he was weaker than his cousin, Hinata. Neji found himself standing outside the test center dressed in a ridiculous giant rubber purple chicken costume wondering what happened. Bway ha 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 ha. Naruto was rolling around on the ground as they saw Neji wander off to go buy fruit from a vendor dressed in medium sleeve light grey jacket with the high collar and black knee-length shorts. He had half the town filled with shadow clones shape-shifted into people wearing Neji's regular outfits. Okay, that was one of the more surreal things we've ever done, Tamrai admitted, hands in the pockets of her medium-sleeve light grey jacket. The long hair looked good on her, though. It really rounded out her appearance. How did we pull it off with the proctors, anyway? I missed that part of the meeting, Taeya admitted with a blush. Ino snorted. Only because you were kissing Naruto while the rest of us were going over it. Really, couldn't you spare us a clone? No, because all of her clones were making out with Naruto clones as well. Kin smirked, hands stuffed in the pockets of her own medium-sleeve light grey jacket. Now girls, Kyuinai admonished, coming up behind them to take her hands out of her own copy of Neji's typical jacket to put them on their shoulders. She looked oddly different with straight hair. She'd passed most of her clan membership tests. It was only right she be allowed to celebrate. I'm the reason we got most of the proctors involved in this, Anko smirked, leaning up against a wall wearing her own copy of Neji's standard attire, and her hair also looked oddly different, worn straight and down. They're ninja, and used to obeying orders. So, you arrange to give them orders to dress and act a certain way, and they do. Yes. But how did you get those orders passed? Simple. Ibuki walked up, wearing a medium-sleeve light grey jacket with the high collar and black knee-length shorts. She brought me into the resets. Sakura jumped as Kakashi put his hand on her shoulder. You're nervous, he told her bluntly, before he tried a reassuring smile. Don't be. I'm sure you'll do fine in the exam. The pink-haired genin couldn't resist a snort of derision. The exam? Ha! I could pass it blindfolded, and in my sleep, no thanks to you. The one-eyed Jonin dropped his attempts at being reassuring and looked at her more closely, assessing his student. Then he spied the gap between her and the Uchiha she was always hanging off of. Slyly, he shoved his headband up off his Sharingan eye for a moment, before replacing it, assured that this was indeed his little genin girl, and not an illusion or replacement. Sakura balled her fists at how often her teacher did that of late. Was she really so obsessed that the moment she's not trying to be an article of the Uchiha's clothing people have to suspect she's an imposter? Sakura, Kakashi began. I've noticed that you're not trying to attract Sasuke's attention this morning. You can tell me if something is wrong. Yes, apparently she was. Sakura only growled by way of reply. Her instructor blundered on, trying to be helpful in spite of his abysmal track record on relationships. His visible eye turned up in a smile. You do so much for this team by encouraging Sasuke. Enough. Sakura threw her arms in the air in anger, getting the attention of half the Chunin hopefuls through her outburst. The Uchiha is a spoiled little pretty boy who can't love a single person other than himself. He's so totally useless in a relationship that his hand probably gets a headache. The boy I thought I was in love with doesn't exist. Because the Uchiha has turned out to be a selfish, useless jerk. And I can't think of any other boy in Konoha that isn't 1,000 times better suited to making a girl happy, except for you, sensei. You've got to be the only male as insecure about your feelings as that poo-wielding emo bandit. And don't you think for a minute I didn't notice how disturbing it was that you fondled Naruto's ass in our genin test. A circle of shock spread outward from this outburst, and Kakashi suddenly got ashamed as he felt the glares on him. Spying Orange, the pink-haired girl flung herself across the courtyard, then she wrapped herself around the blonde, crying, "Take me now. Naruto-sama." A handful of resets ago, that could have landed them in interrogation about who they were and how they'd infiltrated the village, causing a reset. This time when Kakashi dragged the pair, consisting of a resigned Naruto and a struggling Sakura, in front of Ibuki, the torture and interrogation specialist simply formed a set of seals, and without bothering to mold any chakra at all, because Kakashi's Sharingan was covered, so he wouldn't notice, declared, "There is nothing wrong with them." My guess is the girl simply clued into the fact that the Uchiha barely qualifies as human, and that you like him only because you are scarcely any better. It is my expert opinion that both of you are damaged. The true remedy for this is therapy for you and the Uchiha. Anko stepped out from around a corner, dressed modestly and arms folded in sober seriousness. I concur. Post-traumatic stress. It's fairly common, Tsunade appeared to declare. Frankly, I'd call you both unfit for duty, but wouldn't want to punish the poor genin who've already had to put up with you two by failing them out of this exam early. Really, they are to be commended for having put up with you selfish pair of bastards this long. Definite signs of stable minds there, just the sort of people we want to serve as ninja, unlike you and the Uchiha, who, to put it frankly, are a wigged-out pair of self-absorbed basket cases. Kakashi had begun looking around at these new arrivals wildly by the time Shitsune, hefting Tunton in her arms, declared, having put up with an unstable teammate and abuse from their teacher this long, argues in favor of them being strong, dependable sorts, the kind Konoha needs as leaders. Ibuki found himself nodding. Very well. I suppose I can allow them in as just a two-man team. It's not without precedent. You two. He pointed at Naruto and Sakura, before slashing his arm back to point toward the test chamber. Get in there. And good luck to both of you. Kakashi looked down to note that Tsunade had already taken hold of his arm, and with her super strength, he wasn't about to get away without leaving it behind. As she led him away, she invited, "Now Kakashi, tell me about your mother." Shortly afterward, Sasuke found himself wearing a straitjacket in a padded room of Konoha's hospital and wondering what had happened. Kakashi, in the same situation across the hall, wondered much the same. Kin was not the only one to have seen the utility of a well-sprung carriage. Others were now learning how to grow their own, now that Naruto-D provided a blueprint in the form of the one he'd built for her. The combination of a shadow clone driver, wooden horses, and a few wooden soldiers to act as footmen was also a clear advantage in the realm of long-distance travel. Frankly speaking, they could go nearly anywhere in friendly territory in a matter of nights. That was an advantage in several aspects. For one, it meant they could skip out on the whole ambush on the way to Suna time loop pattern very easily just by sending a native back to her home. Tamrai arrived by carriage, clone and wooden horses, at her home village of Sand, stepped out and nodded to the gate guards before roof-hopping to her home. There, she inscribed a few seals on the floor, and used the summoning trick for calling exam instructors they'd adapted for calling Tsunade so she'd arrive in Konoha without a 2-day walk, called the entire Kitsune clan there. As the smoke cleared, revealing everyone, the Sand Kunoichi looked over the costumes they'd prepared to look native in, then waved to show her village. "Welcome to my home. Come on, let me show you guys around." Beiki, the Sand team's Chunin leader, stood tall and looked around behind that half-veil he wore over part of his face. "I'd best call the village council together and inform them of Orochimaru's ruse." With that, the man vanished. "Well, it'll be good to know whether that works or not," Anko allowed, casting a glance aside at Iam while sitting down on a low wall. Iam shrugged. Her father had reacted poorly to the resets. Apparently not every mind could handle the strain, and there was also the fact that running a cooking stall had a considerable amount of drudgery to it that did not go well with infinitely repeating time eliminating what little variation there was. She'd pleaded with him to just close the shop for the duration of the resets, but the man had been too stubborn to, and now, well, she'd been forced to let her father go back to life unaware that time was resetting around them. Instead, the ramen stand waitress had found herself the girl with the best opportunity to bring Beiki into the resets, as the Sand Jonin ate in her stall on the morning of the first test. She'd learned to trust the Jonin, as he was not a bad guy, merely one who was stuck in a bad situation, doing the best he knew how. Now everybody but Gaara on the Sand team was aware of and participating in the time loops. And he couldn't, as he was another container. But, as Beiki's sponsor so to speak, whenever somebody had problems or issues with the Sand Jonin's behavior, Iam was somewhat responsible for him. Being new to the resets, Beiki found it difficult to bend to the Kitsune clan's authority, and often went off on his own for things. It made Iam wonder if they were going to be able to keep him, or if she'd be bringing another person in his place soon. Frankly, the thought wasn't that appealing. At least they'd left Gaara back home in Konoha for this first foray to his village. Kankuro stood and stretched, putting on a glad face under all that makeup. "Man, it's so good being home." Tamrai folded her arms and did not comment. She'd been part of the resets for so long now she barely even remembered this place. Meeting the eyes of her fellow wives, that message got conveyed non-verbally, and it was Kin who took the lead. "Wow." The former Sound Kunoichi enthused. "You know, I've never been to this place. Do you think you'd mind showing us around your village?" "Nah." The puppet user waved off her concerns. "It'd be fun. Come on, first let me show you around our home, since you'll be staying with us. Welcome to the humble Sabaku residence." The mansion was what might be expected of the clan seat for the leader of the village. Construction in Suna would not have been out of place in an Old West movie, although with less wood visible and more adobe. Windows were generally small, thin and high up, to let in less light and hot daytime air, with shutters that could be flung open at night to allow the heat to go out. The roofs were flat, and signs showed that people slept on top of their houses more often than inside them, to escape the heat. Already it was looking very different from Konoha. "Water is a commodity here," Tamrai began explaining, as they all started to head inside the much cooler interior of the building. "You'll find some wells, but the water table around here hides deep, and isn't strong. So much of our water comes in by wagon. We send merchant trains to other countries, and they come back having filled up great barrels and urns in places like River and Rain. Rain country is among the best, since excess water is a nuisance there, so they don't even charge us for filling up." She made a face. "But, since they have to haul it in over dozens or hundreds of miles, water isn't cheap. So no flush toilets, and sponge baths are the common method of staying clean. Anything else wastes too much water." Tenton patted one of her scrolls, smiling. "Luckily, we brought enough with us to probably qualify as a merchant caravan." "Yes," Rai sighed. "But if we use it too obviously, you'll stand out as strangers." Kankuro was chuckling. "You'd be surprised by how many of our people take years of study in our ninja academy just to learn the basic survival jutsu. Sunblock and sunstride are a big deal around here. But also, anyone who can manage enough earth affinity to do that camping trick for distributing waste beneath the ground, well, they'll always have work around town keeping our pit toilets clean. It's not glamorous, but somebody's got to do it or it begins to smell something awful." The puppet user pinched his nose. Tsunade was unruffled as she responded. "With that amount of organic material spread around your towns, the soil would be quite remarkable. If the water problem could be solved, plants could grow like mad around here. Good soil, lots of sunlight, water's the only problem left." "Well, there's actually too much heat and sun for most plants to grow around here," Rai sighed. "Believe me, it's been tried. Most just burn to death in the intense heat, no matter the amount of water they're given. Or, enough of that. We're here to have fun," Kankuro declared. "Who here wants to go out to see a puppet show?" Seeing everyone look at him like he was odd, Rai decided to come to her brother's rescue. "It's actually more fun than you'd think. It's everything you'd get out of a live theater production, plus a ton of things living actors couldn't do, like when the villain gets stabbed, he actually gets stabbed. No amount of faking, 'cause they don't need to. Monsters look like monsters, and not even a ninja could tell they aren't real actors. Suna puppet shows are the best," Kankuro declared firmly. By mutual agreement they'd already decided to allow themselves to enjoy their first trip as a clan to Suna as a sort of vacation. There wasn't a lot left in Konoha that could interest them, other than their training or those funky games playing with people's heads. And while those were fun, after a fashion, they also paled before real entertainments. They'd seen every movie that could be scrounged out of the most forgotten basements in their home village. The prospect of a real night out on the town going to a show none of them had ever seen before was more priceless than gold or jewels. So they went. They had a great time, and enjoyed snacks they hadn't eaten before, watched a show they'd never seen before, sat next to people they didn't know as well as they knew themselves, and generally had a blast. Of course, new sights, new smells, candy most of them had never had before, and a show none among them had seen before, while an excellent vacation away for the dull and boring sameness, did not resolve all concerns as it only posed new questions. "I can't believe they took a gallon of water as admittance costs at the door instead of cash," Kin murmured, wide-eyed over the change. "Don't be," Rai smiled. "You can't drink cash. And like I said, water is a commodity around here. You can run out of cash and still be all right. But you can't run out of water and be. There's got to be more water than what gets brought back by caravans," Chunin mused. "There is." Kankuro nodded. "Like Rai said, we have a few wells, and the water rations from those are like shares in a mine, valuable, and typically bought up by powerful clans or rich individuals. But also most of our D-rank missions are what we call water runs. Which, before anyone asks, they take a sealing scroll with a dozen empty 30-gallon barrels, go out to fill them up in a water-rich country like rain, then bring them back. The puppet user grinned at their guests. 12 gallons a day for 30 days, drinking water for a family of 4 for a month, for anyone who can afford the price of a D-ranked mission. Not so bad, eh? And not so bad for the genin teams, either, Tamrai mentioned. It doesn't take long before they get the idea of taking on 4 or 5 of those missions at once, even up to 12, and just staying an extra day or so at the lake or river they were sent to, filling up all the barrels. As a consequence, water runs are actually the cheapest D rank you can hire, since the genin will most probably be doing several of them at once. She rolled around to face the rest of Clan Kitesoon. And before anybody asks what this teaches, I'll tell you, she volunteered with a smile. First and most important, it gets our genin comfortable in long treks across a desert. They aren't much used to the village until they've got that skill down, so the sooner they learn it the better, and the water runs are excellent for teaching that, as the faster they get back the sooner they get paid. And along the way they have to learn how to pack and carry what they need on those trips, master their own water usage, and any lingering flaws in their desert survival skills or chakra techniques get ironed out in a practical environmental test. She crossed an admonishing eye over her clanmates, some of whom were sweating. Blushing, the guilty ones began putting their lax sunblock chakra exercise back into practice. It teaches more than just that. Kankuro sat them all down at an outdoor cafe in the shade, signaling a waiter with their order using half a dozen hand signs even as he went right on talking to their visitors. Sealing and unsealing barrels into storage scrolls not only gets you comfortable using them, but it is just one more chakra exercise teaching stamina and control. The more of them you can do in a day, the more water runs you can fulfill on a single trek across the desert. One is about all a genin team can do to start with. Sealing 12 barrels full of water isn't easy, as that's a large amount of mass and weight, but they learn to do more quickly. The waiter arrived and set out glasses of drinks before departing. Tamrai took hers up and toasted the group. It's not alcohol. Nobody around here drinks, as alcohol consumption increases your need for water. Common folk can't afford to, but the water waste creates enough stigma against it. Those who are rich enough to afford it don't bother either. As Naruto and several of her clan sisters discovered, to their surprise, they were actually quite needy and gulped down the drinks. Kankuro just signaled for another round, placing a paper note on the table to pay for it all. The second round came quickly. This time they noted, as they took longer drinking them and sipped instead of gulped, they were actually quite fruity and flavorful. Fruit juices provide energy, and cover up the mineral tang and touch of salt used to create these. You lose more than just water sweating, Kankuro remarked, finally touching his own glass. Tamrai smiled her approval to him. Her brother was doing quite well as a guide, and their relationship as siblings had grown stronger ever since he'd been admitted into the resets. Frankly, having techniques to shut down Gaara helped most of all. It meant they could relax their guard a bit and be people more than they used to. Tamrai and Kankuro were only just rediscovering what it meant to be family, and they liked the feelings of knowing someone else had your back in more than just combat. Of course, water runs teach more than desert survival. Tamrai continued to grin her approval to her brother. Though the countries they go to are friendly, they do have to cross borders into other elemental territories. For most of our ninja, that is their first glance into forests or plains, first look at any kind of plants, really. So getting them used to the idea of other territory is not a bad idea all by itself. And it's a bad teacher who doesn't stop and give them a few survival exercises on those new types of terrain the first few times they cross them, or practice stealthy crossings on later trips. We couldn't do any missions effectively outside our own country if we didn't, her brother agreed, before sipping more of his drink. So really a couple hundred water runs gives an excellent start to a ninja, plenty of practice of basic skills, and enough money to outfit themselves decently. Yes, but what happens during a war? Hana pressed, the Inuzuka heiress seeing through the surface. You'd want your ninja doing more than shopping trip-style errands to keep the town alive. And you might have lost relations to those countries you fill up at. Wouldn't an aqueduct be better? It's been tried about 4 or 5 times. Kankuro scowled, putting down his glass. It never works out right. Dang things always serve as a road pointing straight toward us. Most of our defense is armies or ninja invaders getting lost out in the desert, and that doesn't happen when they can just follow the aqueduct straight to us, and invaders always cut them anyway, so the water they ought to supply doesn't arrive and we end up relying on our emergency systems anyway. So eventually we just tore the dang things down. Finishing off his drink, the puppet master left a tip and stood. Besides, we've got emergency water supplies underground. The exact capacity is classified, as are the real entrances and access points. But they're enough to weather a good long siege. And if it comes right down to it, we've got another chakra exercise we learned from Hidden Mist. Those island dwellers learned a way to separate out drinkable water from seawater. Rather clever of them, but they needed it considering how many of those islands of theirs are too small to support freshwater springs. Anyway, if hostile relations block our access to our usual partners in the water trade, we can send our genin on water runs to the shoreline to fill up there. All of our teams have to practice that at some point in our careers, his sister stated, chin resting on folded hands before she too stood up. About half of our genin can do that, and all our ninja higher up. Once you reach a certain point, the mission office gives you that requirement on your water runs to make certain you develop the ability so we have that talent to fall back on in an emergency. It also helps out with negotiations with our neighbors for water rights, as they know they don't have a knife to our throats, that we could do this just fine on seawater alone. Besides, it's a great chakra control exercise for our genin. Kankuro smirked as he began to lead them away. We get so much practice in our various exercises, I'd pit our chakra control and reserves against the ninja of any other village. We're literally practicing all the time, and have tons of different exercises. Although he gave a gentle stare to the group he was leading around, the most basic are still the most important. Several individuals of the clan rather sheepishly restarted their sunblock techniques, having let them slip as their attention wandered. Those performers did pretty well for themselves, Anko observed, trying to draw attention away from the fact her shirt was wet with sweat. But they didn't wear any headbands. Yugao objected, speaking of what she'd observed during the after-show stand-up for applause the puppet masters had achieved. Course not. Kankuro chuckled, glancing aside to meet her eyes. You know about our daimyo reducing our ninja forces. What you don't know is our bounce-back strategy for when he wises up and changes his mind. Tamrai, too, was chuckling. All ninja forces suffer losses. It's a regular part of doing business. Some retire, some desert, and more than a few are killed in ninja battles that are just a regular part of doing missions. So we still have to have a ninja academy to train up replacements. And, like most villages, most of those who graduate our academy are not accepted as genin. But just because a person doesn't have a ninja rank or run missions doesn't mean they ought to stop having ninja skills, Kankuro supplied with a knowing smirk, before turning back to face the course they were following. I told you before, sunblock and sand stride, our most basic chakra control exercises, are almost essential to life out here. Tons of people learn them, even those who have no ambition to become ninja. What that means is Tumrai smirked at her home's plan. We have tons of civilians, failed genin really, who practice those so much they have better chakra reserves and control than most of your Chunin. Several of them go on their own water runs, not hiring genin to do those for them. With more puppet masters than you might believe. Kankuro smirked, then waved their attention over to a loading dock where a number of puppets were at work unloading a wagon, while their masters stayed in the shade. So they do all sorts of things like that. Work people hard and they sweat, and water costs money, so you have to pay them more or else they won't get enough water and they'll die. But puppets cost nothing to feed, don't overheat, and can work like mules without ever needing a sip. We teach puppet mastery in our ninja academy, and those failed genin handle most of the heavy work. They also do puppet shows, like you saw earlier, Tumrai explained. Life out here is hard enough, people take all the advantages they can get. But that violates the basic covenant between ninja villages and their feudal lords, Shit soon observed. One of the conditions all countries share is that ninja skills are to be restricted to practicing ninja. With the exception of academy students, Kankuro smirked. And we get around that by never removing these failed genin from our academy rolls. They don't get listed as any class but the one they ought to have graduated in, under did not make genin rank. But we never actually remove them as students. Tons of villages allow students to continue trying to test for genin even after they've failed a time or two. Someone has to have talked, Anko observed cynically. We don't tell genin how they are getting around the law, Tumrai stated authoritatively. That's a B-class secret, and not available for academy students or their genin friends to know, so they can't blow it. And those who can't keep their mouths shut? The special jonin asked. Get declared missing ninja and executed on sight. The tales they tell are dismissed as wild stories, and at worst we have to practically shut down the town while some samurai ride through on an inspection tour, where everyone dresses in rags and pretends to be more miserable than we are. Then the fun toys come back out again after they are gone, and everyone is so grateful for what we let them have that the daimyo would take away that the secret gets safer every time someone tries to blow it. Besides, this only goes on in Suna itself, and our climate is unfriendly enough, people don't exactly come here if they can avoid it. So we're pretty isolated, and that helps keep this secret. Tumrai laughed. Most of the population of Wind Country stays along our coastline, where life is easier. Tumrai supplied, smiling as she looked around, remembering places from her childhood. The climate is nice there. The heat not so bad, and this infernal wind not as much of a problem. So easily 90% of our people live along our coasts. Population is pretty sparse out here in the trackless desert that makes up the center of Wind Country. You only have small mining towns and us ninja, for the most part, and we ninja come out here to be alone. We like the privacy. Several of our deep cover agents have recently been exposed, Bakey told the assembled Sand Council. I have managed to safely withdraw them to Suna, as their information is priceless. Several of the assembled ninja nodded soberly. The Council of Konoha was made up in large part of civilians, and had power grab issues. The Council of Suna could not afford either problem. The village of Hidden Sand was a military base, filled with military personnel, and had military problems. Civilians there existed only to provide services, not to pass judgment on problems outside their areas of expertise. And the Wind Lord had gone far enough toward destroying the whole town through his various edicts that they couldn't afford any petty squabbling or infighting. Actually, the Ninja Council had a surprising amount of unity, in that they were all opposed to a common enemy who continually sought their destruction, the Wind Lord, daimyo of their own country. However, life wasn't all fun and games either. It is against policy to retrieve agents who must then be added to our ranks as active duty shinobi, one of the senior clan heads reminded. Beiki winced. The man was head of the Mantis, and their previous Kazekage had been fool enough to make the man's own daughter a deep cover agent, then forbidden her retrieval when she was revealed. While the man was far from irrational, he had gotten his daughter reassigned to another country rather than killed. Past bitterness would make his acceptance difficult. And many other of the clan heads had their own bitter experiences to match his. Not for the first time, Beiki counted their past Kazekage a fool. He'd made enemies he didn't need in far too many areas, not excepting his own family. Fortunately, in this case that actually counted as an advantage. Will you make no exception for Tsunade of the Sanin? Beiki asked, getting those old ninja to gape, open-mouthed at him. He smirked. He couldn't help it. And the information she and her party brings is that our Kazekage has been assassinated, replaced by Orochimaru, also of the Sanin. Oh yes. Beiki would have these people eating out of his hand in under an hour. Tsunade walked on her own through the streets of Suna. They all knew the plan was to present themselves as deep cover agents being returned on the uncovering of their identities. That was really the only way to get acceptance they needed inside the village while still using their ninja abilities. It granted them the freedom of the town, despite whatever the council said about putting them on as active duty ninja or not. As if thinking by themselves, her feet had drawn her to the Suna hospital. It didn't take her long to assess the place, dingy and miserable. In her intelligence brief, Yugao had presented Konoha as being too tender-hearted to be good at information gathering. But that had a flip side as well. Tender-hearted people want their sick or injured comrades to get well. Suna, however, had so many eager young students competing for slots on the active duty roster it was often easier to just replace ninja than to heal them. That cost them more than just sympathy. They lost experience when older shinobi perished, and the battlefield awareness that often comes out of a close brush with death, a brush all too often accompanied by injuries. You nearly kill a ninja and he gets much more cautious the next time, and there was a direct proportion between how serious the wounds were and how long they remembered those lessons. So Suna had an interesting conundrum. Between the various factors of the often hard life led in the village, their worst ninja were really very good. But out of the harsh attitudes that developed because of that hard life, their best ninja were not so hot compared to other countries. Outside of their own unique environment, that is. On their home turf, the ninja of sand could kill anyone. The village had many strengths: puppet users, a preponderance of wind jutsu, and the generally excellent chakra control and store of its members. But for all their sterling qualities, medicine was not among them. Their callousness had given them what were, in Tsunade's honest opinion, the worst medics of any of the 5 great villages. They just didn't care enough about saving people, or spare enough attention to getting it right, to be good. Which, again, might tie into and support their amount of puppet users. The Sanin spoke aloud to herself, shaking her head. I sure wouldn't want to be wounded in this village. No wonder they prefer indirect fights. She sternly disapproved. Since the village is accepting you guys back mostly because I married Naruto here, I hope none of you guys mind taking on the Sabaku clan name of Gaara and Kankuro and I, just so long as you are here. It's just easier to tell people you are my family. Naruto gave a nervous Tamrai a cuddle while smiling. But Tamrai-chan, you are family. Yes, I know. The wind mistress gave him a quick peck on one cheek. But I also know you guys are used to a close association by your own clan name, Kitesun. Yes, but we are also ninja. Kunoichi especially ought to be used to going by a different name. Hinata also gave the older girl a hug. Besides, what's all this you guys stuff? Tenten came up to add herself to the growing group cuddle. You practically outrank me when it comes to seniority among Naruto's wives. It's still a difficult question. Tamrai smiled back to the younger girl. They'd truly become close friends. He got romantic with me first, but was training under you earlier, and was already quite fond of you. And we all know Naruto-kun. Hinata giggled while the boy blushed. I am noted, with some respect, that, even though it obviously pained her, Sakura stayed silent during this exchange, despite the fact that she could have argued to be most senior of all for Naruto's affections. The other girls plainly felt she'd lost her place and been disqualified, that it was sustained, and returned, affection that formed a solid bond, so the only kind that counted. But the Pinkette had never been shy about disagreeing over anything before being admitted to the resets. Indeed, insisting on getting her way had once been her trademark, and it got noticed by more than just Iam that the girl was not rising to the bait here. Almost grudgingly, they admitted in their hearts that scored her points. Sakura could have risen up and argued the point, losing what little respect they had been building for her, but the pink-haired Kunoichi seemed to have genuinely begun to change. It did not escape anyone's attention that Sakura was trying terribly hard to get back in their good graces. It was not possible for anyone to be more disillusioned by someone than Sakura had been by the Uchiha in that desert fight against the forces of sand, and that had begun to work changes on her character. She was no longer blindly supportive of the Sharingan, and so had to recreate herself almost totally, as blind devotion to Sasuke had made up a significant portion of her attitude and goals over most of her life, and now had to be replaced by something else. Naturally, once that bias got stripped away, there wasn't a lot left of the old Sakura for the new one to recycle. To no one's surprise, she didn't entirely eliminate the blind devotion aspect of her personality, she'd merely changed to whom it applied, and the obvious target for it was Naruto. Sakura herself didn't think of it in those harsh and clinical terms. From her standpoint, she'd gone from a loved and popular Kunoichi to the very bottom of the social pecking order in nothing flat. Any girl loves to be loved, and most adore being popular. That she'd enjoyed that situation while it lasted was no surprise to anyone. But it was Naruto who'd loved her, not Sasuke. Only by the time she'd figured that out, the boy who'd once loved her had spent several years getting over her already. The Queen of England does not expect to wake up one morning and discover that she is a scullery maid who dreamed all the romance, wealth, position and power. Any girl on the top of her social ladder resents suddenly finding herself on the bottom. Of course, resentment did her no good. But it did a lot to explain why she wanted Naruto back. His love and support had been the greatest privilege of her life. Before, it had enabled her to stay upbeat while surviving the Uchiha's put-downs. Now, though, she'd rather she had it for its own sake. Naruto was a person worth loving in her eyes now. Yes, that was terribly fickle of her, but sadly not unusual. One person's trash is another's treasure, and so on. Most girls don't see guys as valuable until those guys already have other girls after them. It's a bit shallow, but young people often are. If youthful mistakes were crimes, no one would survive to adulthood. Besides, girls often proudly state they have the privilege of changing their minds. Of course, no matter how logical or reasonable, or just typical, a progression that was for a young girl's thoughts of the heart, it didn't incline Naruto any more towards liking her. That girl had hurt him consistently for years. But Sakura was a driven person and, in her own right, nearly as stubborn as Naruto, and she was determined to wear him down. The other girls sheltered him as much as they could, because they honestly held a poor opinion of her, but the pink-haired girl still wormed her way through to do nice things for Naruto from time to time. So the boy soon found himself faced with a choice. He could either accept the kind acts Sakura was trying to do for him, or he could pull an Uchiha and grunt and spurn them heartlessly. Put that way, it was obvious which way he'd choose to go. Wanting to be nothing like the brat who'd had everything and appreciated nothing, Naruto put on a kind face and accepted Sakura's offerings when he didn't have a valid excuse not to. It didn't mean he liked it, or her, or that the wounds she'd given his heart had gone away, but he was determined to be polite about things and not become a second Uchiha. However, receiving acts of kindness does gradually wash away previous hurts, and Sakura began to trust that she'd make eventual progress. This worried the girls around Naruto, who felt they had cause for concern. Seeing a few passerby nodding respectfully to Tamarai, some eyebrows got raised and Hana had to ask, "That's not just a weapon, is it? Somehow that big fan on your back is also a badge of some sort, isn't it?" The Sand Lady smiled in reply, telling her friends and family, "Wind users are respected around here more than you might think. Without us to regularly blow the streets clean of accumulated dust and grit, our village could be buried under a gradual build-up of what the natural winds blow in." She favored the group with a confident smile, posing with her shoulders back. "That's actually one of the other really common D-ranked missions we get in Sand, to go around to all of the mining towns that are out here in the desert with us and blow the streets clean. The first few times you have to do it are really hard. It's exhausting even for the best of us to learn how to move that much wind and control it, even after all of our basic chakra exercises. Too much or too fast, you blow houses down. Too little or too slow and you don't accomplish anything. Get your control wrong and you'll fling houses or swirl the dust in place, or even draw more sand into town." She paused, smacking her lips in appreciation for the effort long since gone through. "But without us, dunes would swallow everything man-made out here in short order. So, if you want to know why we are famed for our wind users, there's your answer. We've got to be good, and our practice makes us so." "And the giant fan?" I am asked pleasantly. "Are given only after you've been granted acknowledged mastery. They don't do a thing but augment your wind techniques, but they are useful for that." Tamarai still preened a bit under the attention. It had been a long time for her feeling an outsider looking in while at Konoha village, and it was nice to be back on home turf again, not the least because it made her important, made her the guide and instructor when for so long she'd been the one learning. It was nice to be a student, to learn and master new things. It was also nice to be valued for one's knowledge from time to time. Then she drooped, recalling something. Favoring her family through marriage with a somewhat sad smile, she told them, "Also, there is another reason why I like to bear this fan. It was my mother's. Not only was she a great wind mistress, but she made fans like this one. This was one of her favorites." Instantly she got consumed in more hugs. Kankuro cleared his throat once all this mushiness threatened to become unbearable. Ahem. Once he had their attention, he continued, liking to be the guide and instructor no less than his sister. Clearing the streets is one thing, but not the most important or prestigious post for a wind mistress. The good ones graduate out of that stage early. Into what? Ino asked perkily. Shitsune, who had traveled a lot, interrupted with her own smile. Have you never wondered what makes wind country so great? Metals and the tools and weapons made from them, Ino answered instantly. That was one of the first things Naruto told us from what he'd learned talking to these two. And Konoha uses lots of weapons made in Suna. Tenten agreed. Kuinai could see where this was going and continued the test. But the mines are all out here in the desert at the heart of wind country. Most of the population lives on the coast. What do they do for a living? The younger Kunoichi all shared puzzled glances among themselves. Wind Teiya answered simply, lifting up her flute. Hey! I learned the basics for my chakra puppet techniques from a missing ninja from Sand, who came to Sound after being recruited. I ought to know a few things about this place. I do play a wind instrument, after all. You hear a few things when you pause and listen to people who know how to ask questions. It's not like this is any big secret, most of you have just led sheltered lives in Konoha till now. She's right, Kuinai interrupted before this could become a fight. When you understand economics, it's truly very simple. Common people make up most of the populations of every country, and common people do not have access to sealing scrolls, special techniques, or any of the many ways we ninja have to get ourselves around. It all comes down to trade. Shitsune took over, at last answering her own question posed at the start of this minor discussion. Common people have only two ways of moving goods back and forth. They can carry it over land, or they can float it by water. What you can carry by hand, beast or cart is comparatively small, so that is the more expensive way to move goods. Ships can carry arbitrarily large amounts, however. Just build a bigger hull. Also, a caravan of wagons and beasts of burden must rest at nights, but ships can move so long as there is wind to take them. So they go faster because they use the whole day and night to travel. So whenever anybody can, they move goods by ship instead of overland. Kuinai took back over this explanation. That's why most every town that isn't a ninja village tries to place itself on a navigable lake or river, if they are not on the coast to start with. It's the fastest, cheapest way to move cargo. Shitsune agreed. So towns that have ready access to the sea trade are more prosperous by default. Ships move by wind, and guess who has enough wind mistresses to serve as street sweepers? Teiya informed the rest of the young Kunoichi with a grin. That's what they graduate to, is that right? Kankuro nodded, pleased by their deductive ability. Yep. They started out as simple escort missions, just like anyone gets when they travel and are afraid of bandits, or in this case pirates. Ship captains regularly hired ninja to ride along with their boats and fight off anyone interested in stealing the cargo. Wherever you have trade, you have people willing to steal that trade. Hana, who tracked plenty of bandit camps, agreed. It is a source of wealth, and prosperity always draws parasites. Tsunade grumbled, still unhappy over the town's medical situation. She'd largely been staying silent as she continued contemplating that problem. Now Tamrai resumed her place leading this discussion. It was her specialty, after all. But one of those ships chased by pirates had a wind mistress from Suna on it, and moving dust out of villages teaches you more than anything else how to control large but gentle amounts of wind. Where most ninja would have torn apart the sails if they tried, she was able to fill up the sheets with wind without breaking them. They sped to safety. But it wasn't long before a captain asked if she could do that outside of an emergency. She could get them to move 3 times as fast as most ships. The ones relying on natural winds could go. Most winds blow about pretty chaotically. Shitsune agreed. So relying on natural wind means using whatever you can get, and you end up going not quite in the right direction most of the time. Using wind mistresses from Suna got around that. Also, you didn't have to rely on the natural strength of whatever wind you happened to find, but could afford to go full force, all of the time. Rai smiled. In whatever direction you wanted to travel. Thus was born the C or even B-class escort forward/propulsion missions. Move ships fast. Hire a kunoichi of hidden sand. So far we've been successful in keeping how to do it a secret. Most villages have tried propulsion using wind techniques, but end up tearing the sheets, breaking masts, or even tipping the ships over. Taeya agreed. So far only Suna's wind mistresses have had a delicate enough touch. Which comes from our street sweeping, but that's an A-class secret. The Suna wind mistress nodded. Not that anybody envies us the practice, she finished out with a grin. It does seem like pretty lowly labor. The daimyo acted quickly to restrict the practice of hiring Suna kunoichi as propulsion to his own ships, and wind country merchants he favors, but we've got more shipping than you'd believe possible. Kankuro explained, rolling his eyes over those acts of nobility, yet pleased by the shipping. It is only fair, we have more coastline than any other elemental country. Rai returned. We have to do something to survive, and you may have noticed food doesn't grow here. We save ourselves half the cost importing it ourselves, rather than paying for third parties to carry it to us. Yeah, but what do you trade for it? Not everyone needs weapons, unless you deal solely with ninja villages, Tenten jokingly observed. Glass. Rai, Kankuro and Taeya all answered together. Everybody needs windows, Rai observed. And what else do you think all that is good for? Kankuro asked, pointing his thumb at the desert. And yes, Tsunade starting rubbing her temples at the idiocy involved. The Wind Lord, by his stupid self-destructive policies, is killing the goose that lays golden eggs, i.e. restricting numbers of ninja in the village that grants him those wind mistresses that make his fleet go so fast that it makes so much money. But he wouldn't be the first noble to be nutso, demanding results utterly contrary to his own edicts. Most of them have at least a little leaning toward that shit, Soon admitted with a grimace. It comes from living sheltered in palaces most of their lives, denied any kind of contact with real people. Courtiers don't count. Back in Konoha, a Naruto clone watched a movie he'd seen enough times to quote in his sleep. Far from being an exercise in self-torture, the young man paid rapt attention to the screen. This DVD was available in both Japanese and English. Watching this well-known movie, whose Japanese lines he could quote without effort, speaking this time in English, the young man felt that he could finally penetrate the otherwise impenetrable code that was this. English. Dynamic entry. Oh, hi Hinata. Naruto rubbed his eyes, then raised them admiringly to his first and still best friend. Nice jumpsuit. Lavender really suits you. Thank you, Naruto-kun. She jumped forward to hug him, white leg warmers rising as her legs curled up behind her, giving herself totally to the embrace of her beloved blonde boy. So he didn't require you to paste on artificial eyebrows? The boy asked. Nope. Hinata caroled. He just wants to experiment and see if a shadow clone can be destroyed by sheer exercise. Can it? Of course. She sing-songed happily, still hugging him. I am clone number 5. Now he wants to quantify how much exercise it takes. But I wanted my Naruto break, so he gave me 5 minutes. How's it going? Taking the two-tone maiden into his lap, Naruto explained as he hugged her, the hardest part was getting the first little bit. Now I think I've cracked it, the rest should come more easily. Do you know they read left to right? Blue hair went flying as she shook her head. No. That sounds bizarre. Black really washed her out and created a combination that was hard to find colors for, so she'd lightened her shade and discovered she was a brunette under the distinctive Hyuga black. It was a look she was much happier with. Besides, it went quite nicely with her eye color. When the Kyuubi added the Hyuga white eyes to her decorations, she'd altered it enough to grant them pupils to their irises, and eliminate the bulging veins problem. Now their eyes only turned that distinctive lavender white when activated, and Hinata had chosen to have eyes as blue as Naruto's most of the time. It was a tribute, but also went well with her new hair. Yeah, it's the little things like that that have been throwing me, he nodded. The duo cuddled for a bit before Hinata got up, pecked him on the cheek, and shouted dynamic exit. That's it guys, hope you like the video. Like, share and subscribe the channel if you want more videos like this. Also tell me in the comment section down below if you have any recommendation about what I should make next. Thanks for watching.